Hey folks, Coach Patrick here, Endurance Nation, back with another Coach podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the elements, part of our monthly series here. For triathletes this time around, I'm going to be talking this month about dealing with the wind, dealing with cold, dealing with heat. And in this special edition, I'm going to focus on the wind specifically. And when I talk about being in the wind, I'm talking specifically, this is just awful. It's terrible. Hey there folks, Coach Patrick here in Endurance Nation, back with another Coach podcast. This monthly series is on the elements. We're dealing with wind, we're dealing with rain, we're dealing with cold, we're dealing with heat. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking specifically to triathletes and dealing with the wind on race day. The wind is one of those unique situations that we encounter on race day that can really take everything and make it move sideways. And there's a couple reasons for that. First and foremost, as a triathlete, wind affects all three of your disciplines, right? Perhaps even your transition setup. And as a result, it's something that completely impacts your entire day. Whereas heat, for example, doesn't really do much to my swim, right? I'm not so worried about that, right? But the wind shows up everywhere. So that's the first part of it. The second part about what makes the wind really confounding for triathletes is that it's not something that sets off a red flag right away. Right? So temperature, water temperature, triathletes are very concerned about that. Road conditions, terrain, rain perhaps even in terms of elements, those are things that are hot button items for triathletes. If it's going to be wet on race day, I want to know it before I get there, right? But most people don't ask so much about the wind. The wind is just kind of a, meh, there'll be wind today, or not so much wind today. But when we talk about wind, there's not only varying degrees of wind, but there's also different directions of wind and also shifting directions of wind. When we think about those three different elements, the wind all of a sudden can become a real factor. So while we don't show up to a particular race talking about the wind, we often come home from race day all about the wind, all about this problem I had, all about this headwind that I felt that maybe you didn't feel, or this magical tailwind that you had that I didn't have, because that's always the case. You guys, it's like you're cheating out there. It's ridiculous. So, how do we deal with the wind on race day? Well, first and foremost, let me talk about wind in sort of a macro level sense, and then we'll get down and break it into parts by discipline, swim, bike, and run. So in a macro level sense, wind is really endemic to the area in which you are racing. So it's worth the time to do some investment in researching what the weather conditions have been like on race day in the area where you've been, right? So for example, if you are in a landlocked area, say middle of the US, the only wind you might be worried about is like a tornado, not so bad. But if you're on the coast, if you're racing on the coast and you've got the ocean or open exposed areas or perhaps at elevation, wind starts to play a factor. Sometimes even shorter course races that happen in urban areas, you'll experience a channeling effect of wind through some of the buildings, like in Chicago, for example, or New York City. That could be really devastating to your race performance in a specific area, right? So it's definitely one of those things that you can understand the baseline level of the conditions of your race by taking a look at the wind. One of the ways we do that inside the team, obviously, is researching our race by looking at other race reports. What do our teammates say about the race? What do they say about the wind, the heat, the cold, whatever it is, right? We can learn a great deal about that. But first and foremost, you want to do some general research on the wind in your area. When you do that kind of research, you're probably going to notice a couple things. If the race does turn out to be a windy venue, then the wind is predominantly following a pattern, right? Winds don't just arbitrarily show up one day from the east, next day from the north, one day from the south, next day from the northwest. When you think about wind, generally speaking, there's some general conditions to it, whether it could be a function of the jet stream, right, moving across the continent, as it were, or in the case of where I live here on the East Coast in Rhode Island, I'm right on the water. So in the morning when it's cool out, and the land is warmer than the ocean, we've got a wind coming off the ocean and coming off of land and moving to the ocean, right? It's moving from the land is cold, ocean is warm, it's coming off the land. So I have a headwind heading out inland coming off the land into the water as it's changed, right? And then as the day goes on and the land heats up and the water stays cooler, all of a sudden I have a switching effect in the wind where now the wind is actually coming inland. It's going outland before, now it's offland, now it's going in. And as a result, I can have there are days when I can have a headwind riding 50 miles, and I can turn around and have a headwind 50 miles back. And that's just normal here, something I've learned over time. If you're hitting a race venue, that may not be super apparent to you, but again, those race reports, and even just looking at a couple days worth of data, you can see, toggle on your whatever app you use or on browser, toggle the wind directional arrows, and you can start to see how things play out. But at the end of the day, you'll have a general sense of what that wind looks like, and that's really important. Wind also has a seasonal aspect to it as well. So there's times of the year where the place where you may be racing is not that windy, or times of the year where it may be particularly windy. So also worthwhile to kind of do a little bit of research on that. And I say that to triathletes because we spend a great deal of time in two disciplines that are greatly affected by the wind. First, the swim, just your safety, right? Wind really changes the dynamics of safety and safe swimming. And then second, on the bike, we spend the most time on race day on the bike, and wind can significantly impact what our performance will be like on the bike. The run, yes, there's an impact, but I would say it's definitely an order of magnitude less than you would experience on the bike. So first and foremost, do the research, know the venue, know the general conditions and or trends of the wind that you see there. You can even go back and look at historical weather. All sorts of information is available to you out there, and I certainly suggest that you avail yourself of that. Okay. Then you want to kind of be aware of the winds heading into race day, so you get a sense for what things will look like. In fact, if you can look at the weather report 2 or 3 days out, if you're on site, you can look and say, oh, the winds on Saturday morning are projected to be the same as they are this morning. My experience this morning will be similar to what I will see on Saturday. It's one of the benefits of getting to a venue early is having, hopefully, a similar weather cycle where you can experience the same conditions or close to the same conditions during some of your final touch-up workouts. Okay? So, all right, so let's talk a little bit about the wind as it relates to swimming. Okay, so in triathlon, we have 2 different types of swims, pretty much. We've got ocean swims, which I would call kind of free range, wide open, super dynamic swims. And then we have closed swims, which are either rivers or lakes, where there's some amount of shelter unless the lake you're on is like Lake Erie or some massive, massive lake. For the most part, the freshwater or river scenario is different than the ocean and open water. And there's a couple different reasons for that, okay? When I think about what wind means to the race venue itself, it has a different impact on the scenario in which I'm racing, right? So working from order of most complicated to least complicated, if you've got winds in an ocean setting, it can take an otherwise, fairly churned up, fairly murky experience with waves. You're kind of already at like a 6 out of 10 in terms of anxiety level related to the race. It can move that easily to an 8 or a 9 because all of a sudden you've got white caps out there. It's kind of choppy visibility just in general. Even if visibility is fine, standing up close to the water with the spray and everything, visibility really goes down, right? So we have sort of this general sense of concern related to our ability to see buoys, to see one another, to see safety craft, etc. And then on top of that, you add the dynamics of the wind with the water and the way the water moves. In an ocean setting, obviously, the water has a current to it in terms of pulling off of the beach, and also some waves coming in. And when you have wind coming at you or and pushing the waves in, or wind pushing the waves out, really changes that dynamic in terms of what experience you're going to have both entering and exiting the water. So for me, the wind really adds an added degree of difficulty to an already complex situation in an ocean swim. And if you find yourself on race morning with wind that's not strong enough to jeopardize or cancel the event, but is strong enough to affect your swim, I strongly suggest you get down there early enough, not only so you can try and do a little swimming if there's a safe warm-up area, but also that you can watch other waves go out and see how they are affected by the wind and what the terrain, what the surface of the ocean is like in the conditions of that wind, right? So on a calm, nice ocean morning, you could have a great swim, no problem. Almost feels like a lake, right? Just a little salty. But if you've got chop and you've got wind, waves can increase in size, right? Currents can be feel more significant. And we as swimmers in wetsuits on top of the water are impacted in terms of being pushed in or pushed back, depending on the direction in which the wind may be blowing and we're trying to achieve our goals. So it can make swimming in the water pretty difficult. So you definitely want to get down there and see those other areas. When it comes time to swimming and swimming with wind, there's a couple key things to play in mind. First and most, you want to know exactly what the course is like, and you want to know how the water is moving independent of the wind, right? So if I'm swimming out, if it's a straight course, I'm straight out, parallel to the shore, straight back in, I know the direction of the wind and I can kind of compensate for that wind against the way that the water is moving. So I almost have to kind of point myself to the wind, because naturally when wind comes at you as an athlete, we have this natural tendency to move in an oppositional direction, like dog on a leash syndrome, where I'm trying to get into the wind and fight that wind. Even though I want to go this direction, I'm kind of fighting that wind off to the side. And that kind of sets you in a place where you can easily get off course, not because you're having trouble sighting, but because when you are not directly looking at a buoy, your internal compass is saying, I've got to fight this wind, right? And so it's really important for you to know how the dynamics of that work. Now, in a river or in a sort of freshwater scenario, wind can certainly churn things up, but it's definitely not as impactful as it is in the ocean. Getting some whitecaps on a lake can certainly be disconcerting, but we're not also dealing with a current in that lake, for example, that's also working either with, against, or in sort of in a negation effect to the wind that's blowing. When we think about what that means as an athlete, having that freshwater experience, you definitely have a sense of like, hey, I'm never that far, at least for me, from shore. I'm never that far from finding my way back. I'm on a lake. There are boundaries to this thing, as opposed to an ocean. Like technically, yes, there is a boundary, but I can't see the other side of that thing. I'm not so sure how safe I feel about the boundary effect of this water, right? And so in those scenarios, I believe that if I had to rank them, it would be ocean, then lake, then river, because rivers have defined currents, and since they're sheltered enough, most of the time the current itself is stronger or focused enough that it overcomes the effect of any specific wind, and your primary focus then is dealing with the current, which is what you showed up to do. But in a lake scenario, it can again mess with you to the point where sometimes if you've got a good wind blowing in off the water, it may be difficult for you to get out. You almost feel like there is a current, even though there isn't a current, right? So what does it mean to swim well into the wind? A couple things. First and foremost, staying low to the water, right? So we're not out of the water a great deal is really important, right? Kind of reducing our profile. Second of all, getting a sense for which way the wind's blowing, because that's where the spray is going to come from. So if the wind is coming from my left and I breathe to my left, there's someone over there, even if they're 10 feet away, I'm going to get a mouthful of their spray and possibly even some water being blown this way as well. So I want to breathe with the wind at my back. So I want to spend most of my time making sure that I'm breathing away from the direction of the wind, so I'm sheltered and I'm not taking that water on. It's not affecting my goggles, etc. Right? I would also sight more frequently, so I had a chance to kind of reassert my direction based on where the location of the buoy was, so I'd feel more comfortable about that, right? Finally, I definitely would want to make sure that I was comfortable with what the exit scenario was. I always go check out exit scenarios anyway for just the surface, the terrain, etc. How do I feel? But I believe that with the wind blowing, that's when you're most tired. That's when you make the simplest mental mistakes. And if we can be a little more focused at that point in time and understand like, oh, hey, yeah, the wind's still going to be blowing this way, or it's going to be blowing from my left, I got to be careful. All of that makes a difference, right? So you can really start to use the wind as the main guide when you're swimming out there. Again, unless you're in a river situation where the current's kind of overwhelming you. By all means, pay attention to what the race director is saying. For me, again, wind is just one of those sort of insidious things on the swim that we don't really think about, but ultimately can change the dynamic of the day. So really important to know about, okay? And also, just to be clear, before I leave the swim part of this talk behind, I'm talking specifically about wind as a generic windy day. I'm not talking about storm cell wind or something that's a concentrated freak event. In most of those cases, you rely on the race director and your own personal instincts to make sure that you're making the right decision with regards to the swim, right? Okay, so second discipline, time on the bike. Wind on the bike. Okay, so with triathlon, we have many different distances of races. We have off-road, we have on-road, we have short races, we have long races. Generally speaking, the longer your race, the more the effect of the wind can work against you. It can also work for you, but most people don't feel the for, they feel the against, right? And so when you're out there and you're racing on your bike and you're dealing with wind, there's a couple different things you want to think about from a parameter perspective. Again, getting a sense of the general direction of the wind is really helpful, because you can overlay that on the course and say, oh yeah, for the most part, I'm going to have a tailwind, heading out for the most part, say first 20 miles, but I'm going to have a headwind back for the next 36. That's really good to know, sort of from a mental perspective, just to prepare yourself for how you're going to handle your day. Because we ride very differently in a tailwind versus a headwind, right? Or even a cross, right? Secondly, you want to get a sense for what the wind will be like on a general basis, because it may affect your setup. If you're a tinier person or you're not comfortable handling your bike in gusty winds, you may be against having a disc wheel or a deep front wheel that's more likely to catch the wind and kind of make you less comfortable on the bike. If it is windy, you may want to invest in a front aero bottle solution for hydration so that you can drink without having to take your hands off the bars. There definitely have been years and races where I felt like every time I wanted to get a drink, the wind would blow. I'd take my hand off, I'd put my hand back on, right? Like, someone's teasing me, because you really had to be careful with relation to your bike and comfort and ability to handle that bike. And triathletes, sad to say, are not renowned for their bike handling skills. So it's something for you to think about in terms of how do we stay safe, how do we make good decisions there in terms of the bike setup. When we are operating in the wind, regardless of the direction, aerodynamics, the impact of them is increased by an order of magnitude. So if you're riding on a flat and you're riding at 18 miles an hour in your aero position, great. If you're riding on the flat in a headwind and you're in your aero position, you might see 16.5 or 16.75 or maybe 17. Like, bummer, but hey, right? But if you are not aerodynamic and you are pushing hard to earn your 18 and the wind comes in, it finds any problems you have with your setup, your helmet, your wheels, your bottle position, your kit, your hand position, all of that stuff gets magnified. And it could take you what you normally push a good decent effort to see 18 miles or 16, 17 miles an hour. You might be pushing that same effort and lose 3 to 4 miles per hour in a headwind just because your setup is aerodynamically inefficient. So sometimes we feel a little over the top showing up at race day with this super high-tech machine that probably landed, fell off the back of a spaceship. But the real reason behind that is the aerodynamics makes a big difference. And any energy we can conserve and apply to the run, to the later in the day, the better off we will be. And so really making sure that you're all buttoned up. It's not a lot of time for you to make last minute changes should you find out race week. But if you do know that your venue is windy, then spending the time to get it right, to cut out the cables, to make sure your kit is nice and snug, to make sure you don't have anything hanging off the side of you in terms of like food or other debris, right? Like everything's nice and tight, everything's buckled down, everything has its place on this bike so you can be super smart, right? So that's also important. Now we can talk a little bit about how wind plays out when you're actually riding on the course. So again, there's 3 types of wind on the course. We've got a headwind coming at us, tailwind pushing us, and some flavor of a crosswind either side. It could be a cross head, could be a cross tail, could be a straight cross, all sorts of different wind that can impact you. For the most part, crosswinds, although annoying, are pretty ineffectual at slowing you down. Most bikes are aerodynamic enough these days, they're good. Unless it's really gusty, you'll adapt to the pressure, the tension of the wind from the side. And quite frankly, it's nice to have some wind blowing on you when you're biking to help cool you off. Since it's not coming directly at you, it's not strong enough to really impact your speed, right? But because courses do turn, and you have to go back to where you started, there probably will be a time when you have to turn that bike from that crosswind into a head or a tail. So some things to think about. If you're riding along in your happy place, your heart rate's good, everything's fine, you're doing the speed that you want, and all of a sudden you've got to take a turn and turn to a headwind, that same effort, that same level of comfort, if you maintain it, will mean a lower speed because it's more work to travel into the wind. So you may go from 18 miles an hour to 16 miles an hour, turning from a cross to a head, but we still want to keep our heart rate roughly the same and our power the same. At that point in time, we use our data to make sure that we are riding the right effort that we need. Even though it does mean slowing down a bit, it's putting in the right effort that matters most because again, we're still setting ourselves up for the run. What rookie athletes will do is they'll have an 18 mile an hour number on the dial, so happy. They turn and they're riding along into this headwind, and they look down, they see 16, they see 15, they freak out. Like, where's my 18? I love 18s. And they start working harder. They start pushing more watts. They start grabbing on the bars. And they grind it out for 10 miles, for 35 minutes, whatever it is, pushing to try and get the number they want. At the end of the day, they're racing their heart rate, and they're pushing really hard to get it in a situation where it's really hard. You know, a hill is nothing more, a headwind is nothing more than a headwind. It's just that with hills we know when they end. I can see it. With wind, I never know when that's going to end. It's a lot more insidious. So rather than pushing into that wind, we maintain our same steady effort. We accept the fact that we will be a little bit slower because of conditions. We trust the fact that our competition is not being so smart and is messing up their run. And instead, we look to opportunities where we can maximize our speed on the course. And a case in point would be the tailwind. So if we're riding our 18-mile-an-hours, we turn into a headwind, we stay at the same power, same heart rate, but now we're going 16 miles an hour, we're kind of bummed. But we stay same power, same heart rate, 16 miles an hour, we turn again, and now we got a tailwind. Well, all of a sudden, that same effort, that same heart rate, you maintain that. Instead of being 16 miles an hour because you're in a headwind, you're in a tailwind, now you're seeing 20. Your average was 18 before, you saw 16 in a headwind, now you see 20 in a tailwind. At the end of the day, you get back, your average will be 16 miles an hour, right, or whatever it is, and you'll be fine. Your heart rate and your power will be flat. You'll be prepared to run. You haven't overexerted because of the conditions. You're ready to be successful, right? You're going to ready, in terms of our world, succeed by not slowing down. If you push into that headwind, then the natural reflex from pushing against that headwind is to back down, is to take off the pressure, say, hey man, I got to recover in this tailwind. And that tailwind is an opportunity for some free speed. Not free speed at work, but free speed. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that there's another element of tailwinds that really make a difference, which is when you do have a tailwind, it's hard to notice because you don't notice any wind. Things are super quiet. You don't feel that there's any wind at all, even though you can see flags moving. You don't feel like there's really any wind. You only feel that wind again when you get cross head or head again. So experienced cyclists always know to look at flags, to look at the airplane field, little sock thingies, to look at things that are blowing in the wind, leaves, right? The leaves are all blowing and they're much lighter color than normal. That's because you're seeing the bottom of the leaves, which means the tree leaves are being blown this way. So I know I've got a tailwind if I'm heading in that direction, right? Little tricks like that. Trust that. Don't trust your sensation of wind because you're moving and you've got wind against your body from the work that you're doing on the bike. Very hard to put those two together. So in many cases, wind on a bike leg in a triathlon is a real opportunity for you. It's going to ramp up the degree of difficulty in such a way that it makes good decision making very difficult by the competition. So if you're on top of it, you're already at a distinct advantage. And then you can look at that over the course and then decide, or know at least ahead of times, I know I was worried about mile 25 to 30 being hilly and hard, but really I think mile 30 to 40, 42 is going to be challenging because of this headwind section. You can kind of get your head around that. You're in a much better place as you go into the race because you're familiar with the course, you're familiar with the costs, and you also know the areas then where you do need to stay super special aero and making sure you minimize the cost of your body on the bike. Okay? All right, so final piece of the puzzle, little lemonade break here. We're going to talk about wind in the run. Normally, wind and running, I'd be like, man, but as you know, our partners at Stride have just released a new pod, a new edition that accounts for the wind. And we're getting one of these pods in the next couple of weeks here to test it out and to give feedback, not only back to Stride, but also to bring that information out to you, our listeners, and to the team as well in terms of race execution. And so wind on the run is a really tricky thing. Does wind speed, does the placement of wind affect your ability to run? Does it affect your pace? Yes. Absolutely. Does it make racing harder? Yes. Does it impact triathletes more than general runners? I would say yes. And the reason why I say yes, the reason why triathletes need to pay attention is that because by the time you get to the run, most of the time you're on the rivet. You're either in a short race, still just pushing at threshold, sub-threshold, or in longer races, you're getting really tired. Like you're running low on glycogen, you're eating. Sometimes I could just walk over to you and just kind of poke you and you might fall over, right? Because you're just in that state of fatigue, both mentally and physically, where even small effects can have a big change on your performance. And wind is certainly one of them. So super important to note. So I factor the wind element of my day, not so much into the effect it's going to have on my paces, but more so the effect it's going to have on my perceived exertion. So I want to go back to that tailwind headwind mention that I had earlier. which is to say that when you have a tailwind behind you, you don't hear anything, and if you don't hear anything, you don't feel anything. We don't feel tailwinds when we run. We feel nothing. In fact, if you have a tailwind behind you, you actually feel hotter, because the tailwind is negating any wind you might have coming at you from actually running through space. And when you have that tailwind behind you, heat can accumulate super fast. It's especially in the hotter or tropical venues. Tailwinds are, practically, result death sentence for athletes who are chasing a time, because it sneaks up on them and makes life really, really hard. So rather than, being victim to that, we can use our heart rate monitor. We can correlate our pace, which seems easier, and our power, which seems a little bit lower. We got this tailwind behind us, and make sure that we're not overheating as we go through this. So these miles with a tailwind are easier from a speed power perspective, but they are potentially more costly from a heat and heat accumulation perspective. So while people may focus on headwinds, I honestly start by saying, where's this tailwind when I'm running? Because I'm really gonna feel it, right? Headwinds, again, as hard as they may be, they do help cool you off as a triathlete, and that's a real benefit, especially for those of you who are pushing or kind of on the red line effort, no matter where you are in the race. So a couple things to think about when you're running and running into wind. Running into wind is a lot like running on a hill. So when we run on a hill, we shorten our stride, we become more efficient. We think about being effective as a runner. The wind is the same way. Any technique-oriented penalties you have in terms of efficiency or cadence become magnified into the wind. So when I feel that wind, I respond the same way that when I feel an incline, which is to tighten up my stride, to think about my form, to get back inside my box, making sure that I am the most efficient, effective runner as I can be, because that will make me faster than just trying to run harder, right? The natural instinct I mentioned earlier, that dog on a leash effect, that when I run into a headwind and I'm looking at a number I love on my watch, my natural inclination is to keep pushing. I want to keep that number. I'm going to push into this headwind. But I've got to balance the location of that headwind against how I feel, against where I am on the course. And if I'm at mile 3 of a 13.1 mile race at the end of my triathlon, there's no way I'm going to push into that headwind. Maybe the last mile, maybe the last 2 miles, or part of the last 2 miles, right? But I can't do it that early. It's too soon, right? We know that the line and a half comes at mile 10, the line in a full Ironman comes at mile 18, and we can't possibly put ourselves in a position to suffer so much early on with the hopes that we will recover as we continue moving, and then we'll still have enough left at the end of the day. So once again, we're looking at wind early on as a mechanism that undermines the competition's ability to compete with us and to be successful. And we really pay attention as a runner to where the areas of the wind are not in a head situation, because at those points in time we will feel very hot, and we've got to really manage our core temperature and our hydration. When you do have wind or strong wind on the run, it absolutely makes a difference that you run behind someone else and you draft. You spend less energy, it's less work if you're drafting off of someone, and there's no shame in being a smarter runner. At Ironman Cozumel last year, I had a young man, we got off the bike right on the coast in Mexico, brutal wind we've been experiencing on the bike, and he was like, hey, tuck in behind me, I'll run for a couple minutes and then you come and go, we'll go. And he ran for like a minute and he kind of looked back and I was already way back. He's like, come on. And I was like, nope, I can't run that fast, right? So he was doing the right strategy in terms of, yeah, we should work together when we're running, totally legal, right? But his execution was off the mark because he was running faster than we should have been running in a response to that wind, right? And we all make mistakes, right? But it's an important thing to note that you've got to stick to the numbers you know. So you've got a heart rate number and you've got a power number or you've got a pace number on the dial. And having those metrics are really important because they help you sort out what is the best way to move forward in the given scenario. So when you have a headwind on the bike, steady power, steady heart rate makes a big difference. So we know that you're doing the right thing even though the speed on the dial may drop. On the run, same deal. Into a headwind, we use power, we use our heart rate as a guide to make sure that we're doing the right effort even though the numbers don't look good. And similarly speaking, on the flip side, we use that power number and that heart rate number as a guide to make sure that we're cracking the whip and staying on the pace. We don't want to run extra hard into a tailwind, just like we don't push into a headwind, but we want to stay that same steady effort. And that steady effort into a wind has me slower, but that steady effort into a tailwind has me faster. And overall, what we've achieved here is that nice, steady, flat line that allows you to be successful, helps you avoid slowing down, which is, failure as far as we are concerned in a multi-sport race at the end of the year. So that's kind of thinking about wind in a racing scenario for triathletes. I'm sure I missed some stuff. So if you have comments, questions, or thoughts, please post them here, put them in the comments. I'll be happy to answer you. But most importantly, I want to go back and just remind you all that Stride unit, the new one, is coming out. I can't wait to test it. You're going to see some stuff on Facebook. You're going to see a lot of stuff inside the team. I'm going to have questions about this. I'd love to hear what your questions are as well. This definitely becomes another great tool in the arsenal for endurance athletes, people who are out there long enough that the elements do play a significant role in their ability to perform, and how we can use that data to become smarter, savvier, and ultimately faster triathletes as well. So stay tuned for that. And of course, shout out to our friends at Stride for the opportunity. Thanks so much for tuning in. This has been Coach Patrick with another Coach Podcast. I'll be back with another element, another story, another podcast in another week. I'll see you guys.